Hello everyone, I hope you're all having a wonderful day. Thank you so much for joining me as I go over the introduction to Medicare, what it is and how it applies to clinical trials. So I know the mere thought of Medicare can intimidate people due to its overwhelming nature, so today we will be going over how it applies to clinical trials. Whether you're brand new to Medicare applications and clinical trials or an experienced veteran, this knowledge can be very useful because Medicare is a foundation for coverage determinations going down the road. So with that being said, thank you once again for joining, and let's get started. Firstly, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Stephen Alcantara, and I'm a Clinical Research Analyst for PFS Clinical based out of Madison, Wisconsin. The points that we will be discussing include history, evolution of Medicare coverage for clinical trials, what is Medicare and how does it work, and qualifying clinical trials according to Medicare. So right now we will go over a brief history and evolution of Medicare as it applies to clinical trials. The birth of Medicare today, as we know it, began with the Social Security Amendments of 1965. The Social Security Amendment put the Food and Drug Administration, also known as the FDA, in charge of evaluating investigational items for market approval using safety and efficacy data from clinical trials, while the HCFA, known as the Healthcare Financing Administration, which today is known as the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, determined the coverage approval of FDA-approved items. As time passed, the healthcare technology market began to explode as new medical technologies were developing at a faster rate than the FDA could approve them. Limitations in FDA resources produced substantial backlogs, and to give you an idea of how big that gap was, the number of FDA approval submission requests, only for devices, increased from 330 in 1992 to 1,895 in 1993. And the time it took to review said submission request jumped from 98 days in 1990 to about 213 days in 1994. So this delay impacted the efficiency of the entire system in general. With the FDA being so backed up, it affected the number of items and procedures that were presented to the HCFA to be even considered to be covered to begin with. So decision making became really difficult for healthcare providers because they may have had knowledge of a device, whether it was investigational or market approved, that could positively impact patients, but the items or procedures necessary for the device weren't covered by insurance. As a result, the government was forced to implement more detailed Medicare coverage policies to ensure patients could receive proper treatment while still maintaining a sound administrative approval process. So their answer came in 1994 to 95, as we see here, when the HCFA and the FDA entered into an interagency agreement to establish a process for placing devices with IDEs into one of two categories based on level of risk. Category A was for novel, first-of-a-kind devices for which absolute risk of the device type has not been established. And Category B was for devices for which the underlying questions of safety and effectiveness have been resolved for that type of device. Category B devices are often newer generations of already proven technologies or replications of existing devices by other manufacturers. So this coverage development just paved the way for the future expansion and regulation for not only devices but also for investigational pharmaceutical drugs. As we see in the year 2000, Medicare began to cover the routine costs of qualifying clinical trials under the expanded coverage policy, also referred to as NCD 310.1, which was updated again in 2007. Now the word qualifying is very important, but we will discuss that later, how a trial is determined whether to qualify. But the message here was that Medicare was formally expanding coverage beyond the reasonable and necessary definition established by the Social Security Amendments. So now we've arrived to Medicare in the present day. Medicare is the federal health insurance program for people who are 65 or older, certain younger people with disabilities, and people with end-stage renal disease. There are four parts of Medicare. We have Part A, which is considered hospital insurance and covers inpatient hospital stays, skilled nursing facility care, and hospice care. Part B is considered medical insurance and covers certain doctor services, outpatient care, medical supplies, and preventative services. Part C, also called Medicare Advantage plans, is a Medicare health plan offered by a private company that contracts with Medicare to provide a person with all their Part A and Part B benefits with added perks such as having access to health maintenance organizations, also called HMOs, or special needs plans. And then we have Part D, which adds prescription drug coverage to the original Medicare coverage. So for those of you who may be new to the concept of a Medicare claims process, here's how it works. So when an item or procedure is performed by a healthcare provider on a patient, a claim is generated. A claim is a request for payment of Medicare benefits for services furnished. And there are very specific rules that must be adhered to when filing a claim. So when filing a claim under Parts A and B of Medicare for clinical trials, a variety of information is necessary in order to obtain reimbursement. Now the claims process is very complex, but just to give you an idea of what some of the necessary information is, I've included just a few examples. So physicians and other healthcare providers use the International Classification of Diseases System, also known as ICD, to classify and code all diagnosis, symptoms, and procedures recorded in conjunction with hospital care in the U.S. An ICD-10 diagnosis code is required on all Medicare claims submitted and must be coded as specifically as possible. There are also procedure codes to indicate what items or services were performed on the patient. These codes are called CPT codes, which stands for Common Procedural Terms, or HCPCS codes, which stands for Healthcare Common Procedure Coding System. Now, I know it's spelled HCPCS, but just to ensure you, they are called HCPCS codes. Whenever a claim is submitted, all these codes can be included, depending on the scenario. So when the claims are processed, Medicare can tell if the appropriate procedures were performed based on that patient's diagnosis. So I've included some examples of what these codes may look like, as each code has its own unique formatting. As we see here with the ICD-10 codes, they will usually never go into the thousands place, and they may have a letter right in front of them. The CPT codes are usually some random assortment of 5 numbers, and the HCPCS codes will usually have a letter in front of them followed by 4 numbers. So the qualifying status of the clinical trial can affect the application of these codes. And like I mentioned earlier, we can now go into further detail of what a qualifying clinical trial is. As mentioned earlier, there have been a lot of rules regarding coverage determinations established since 2000. But all these rules don't really mean anything if your clinical trial doesn't qualify according to Medicare. The instructions that you need to know to determine if a trial qualifies can be found within the National Coverage Determination, also called an NCD 310.1. So I've provided a link to the NCD here on the PowerPoint slide if you want to see the rule in more detail. If for some reason you can't access the link, if you simply Google NCD 310.1 Medicare, the result you find should take you to the CMS page. Now, there are 4 base requirements made by NCD 310.1 that all need to be accounted for in order to carry out a clinical trial. First, the subject or purpose of the trial must be the evaluation of an item or service that falls within a Medicare benefit category. The Medicare benefit category is also included in NCD 310.1 and contains more than 70 categories that are considered covered by Medicare. So I thought I'd save some space by not including every single category, but if you go to that link or Google it, the list is included in the rule. For example, here at PFS Clinical, among the many studies that come through our office, we get a lot of oncology studies trying to develop better cancer drugs, which would fall underneath the drugs and biologics Medicare benefit category. Secondly, the trial must have therapeutic intent. So the whole purpose of clinical trials to begin with should be to make something that further improves outcomes for patients while gaining data to be sent to the FDA for safety and efficacy to further support the therapeutic intent of the drug in question. Thirdly, the trial must enroll patients with diagnosed disease rather than healthy volunteers. And this ties back into the explanation that I just gave for the second point. And finally, the clinical trial must be deemed in order for it to qualify. Now, when a clinical trial is deemed, that means that the protocol has the necessary characteristics most clinical trials should include as established by the NCD 310.1 policy. Now, I've included the 7 examples given in said policy just so you can see what these characteristics are, but they're pretty straightforward and don't require very in-depth explanation. There are multiple ways that your clinical trial can be deemed automatically, meaning by having a study go through one of these routes, the trial is presumed to meet the characteristics mentioned earlier and are automatically qualified to receive Medicare coverage. For example, if a trial is funded or supported by government agencies such as the National Institutes of Health, also called the NIH, or a trial is considered deemed if it's conducted under an Investigation New Drug Application, also called an IND, reviewed by the FDA, in which you would receive an IND number showing your trial is deemed. As long as the clinical trial meets these criteria, then they're considered qualified studies and will be able to receive Medicare coverage. So I've attached a picture of the most common format you will see to determine if the clinical trial qualifies for coverage. I filled out some of these boxes so you can see what kind of language you would use when answering these questions, just so that you have an idea of what a completed qualifying analysis would look like, just in terms of answering those 4 questions that we went over. So if any one of these boxes is a no, then it's not considered a qualifying clinical trial. Now that your trial qualifies for Medicare coverage, you may begin to analyze your study and determine if items are billable or not billable based on other Medicare language such as reasonable and necessary justification, or using other NCDs and LCDs, which stands for local coverage determinations. But that is a webinar for a different day. So that's everything I have for you today. I hope your interest has been piqued because we're going to have some fantastic mini webinars being released down the road by more of our staff. And those will go into even more detail regarding the process of analysis and more benefits that we provide over here at PFS Clinical. So thank you so much for listening and have a fantastic day.